Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to get started with today's webinar, Working in Social Justice. Again, thank you so much for joining us for this series of dynamic and national conversations on creative youth development. My name is Ashley Hare. I am the co-founder of and adult accomplice staffer at Reframe Youth Arts Center in Phoenix, Arizona. I'm also the national coordinator for the Creative Youth Development National Partnership, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. I'm excited for this webinar today. We have some incredibly wonderful speakers who will quickly introduce themselves in just a moment, but first I want to give some context to people can't hear me. 1 second. Hello, everyone. Can you all hear me now? I can hear. Wonderful. Welcome. So excited to have you. Glad you can hear my voice. So thank you again for joining us today on this webinar, Working in Social Justice. This is a series of dynamic national conversations on creative youth development. My name is Ashley Hare, and I am the co-founder of and adult accomplice staffer at Reframe Youth Arts Center in Phoenix, Arizona. I'm also the national coordinator for the Creative Youth Development National Partnership, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. We have a wonderful conversation today with some incredibly wonderful speakers who will introduce themselves in just a moment before their mini presentations. But first, I want to give some context to this learning series and then outline our time together today. This Creative Youth Development Learning Series is designed to amplify key themes in a set of briefs that our colleagues in this field have written. These written briefs on which each webinar is based are part of a first phase of the Creative Youth Development Toolkit for the field, which is a multi-year CYD National Partnership project that's being led by Americans for the Arts. Each of these webinars will engage a diverse community of stakeholders from young people, artists, scholars, practitioners, to explore new paths forward to creative youth development practices. This online series is brought to you by the Creative Youth Development National Partnership in collaboration with Grantmakers for Education's Arts Education Impact Group. It is also hosted by the National Guild for Community Arts Education and made possible from generous support from the Claire Rose Foundation in San Diego. During today's webinar, Working in Social Justice, we will hear key insights and recommendations presented by Dr. Bettina Love that has been recently released in the paper Working in Social Justice. And we'll hear from nationally recognized practitioners whose work with youth is deeply grounded in social justice, which is one of the 3 values of creative youth development. So we are scheduled to be with each other for 60 minutes today. Due to the large number of participants, all your lines have been muted. Dr. Bettina will share first, followed by Robin, and then Mika, and then afterwards we'll open up to have a conversation with you all. If you would like to ask a question or share an idea as we get to that conversation portion, we encourage you to do so. I see that everyone is already using the chat box. Please put your ideas as they flow, as they come, any questions that you may have. I'll be monitoring the chat box as we are listening to these presentations and then taking all those questions and comments for our moderated discussion after our short presentations from our 3 presenters. Again, thank you for being here. The speakers will now briefly introduce themselves, briefly say who they are, their pronouns, and why this work of social justice. So we'll briefly start with Dr. Bettina, then go to Robin, then Mika, and then start the presentation. So Dr. Bettina.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me on this call. Thank you to Arts for America, National Guild, and all the partners. I'm a professor at the University of Georgia. This is my 8th year here. I can't believe that. And I do work around issues of justice when it comes to youth, queer youth. I look at anti-Blackness in schools and how it operates. And I'm also deeply embedded in thinking about how hip hop can be an integral part of the classroom, not something set aside, but hip hop can be centered in the classroom. So really working with community groups and scholars, thinking about the ways in which arts and art education, particularly when it comes to Black arts and movements, can be integrated in the classroom in ways in which that don't just have it as a side piece, but also deeply integrated and thinking about putting that in the center of our work.
Beautiful, thank you. Hi.
Okay, I'm back. Hi,
There you go.
I'm the executive director at Groundswell. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I do this work because I want to be free.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Okay.
There you
Hi.
go.
Thank you. I'm Mika Lemoyne. I am a mentor teaching artist at Destiny Art Center in Oakland, California. And I am a white cisgendered queer femme. I use she, her, hers pronouns. And social justice work because I believe that young people and arts are at the center of envisioning our future. Thank you. And it's an incredible honor to be on this call with these amazing, amazing folks. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent. Dr. Bettina Love, would you like to start? Guide us through today?
Yeah, thank you. So I think you all who are on the call today have seen the document going around that talks about what the social justice work look like in critical youth development spaces. And I was honored to get the opportunity to write that and to think through some of these major ideas. And the first thing that I wanted to do in that piece is really have a conversation about the history of the field, because I think we always have to understand how history impacts the work that we're trying to do now. And when we look at that and we look at the field, we know that the field has gone through many iterations and has had many names throughout the years, you know, juvenile and all of these different terms. What we know is that the field of engaging with youth in ways in which that are creative and trying to bring the best out of them has been deeply impacted by the ideas of racism and homophobia and sexism and classism and transphobia and Islamophobia and all those phobias. And so we have to be able to think about that and how we understand the work that we do now. And so if you go to the first slide, so this is a piece of artwork by an artist out of Detroit named Jonathan Edwards. And in this piece, he asked this very poignant question, what do you see when you see us? And what inspired this piece was the murder of Stephon Clark in Sacramento. And I think as we do work with youth, there's this automatic idea that we see them for who they are. And I don't think that's always true. I think we really have to be thinking about how the field has been deeply situated in ideas of othering and ideas of who is valuable and whose culture is valuable, and how we're going to engage with youth, but not really engage with youth. And so the conversation, I think, always has to be around, you know, what do they see when they see us? And I love this piece by Jonathan because it really gets at the root of the youth that we're trying to engage with, the youth that walk into the building, and do we see the brilliance and the beauty and the complexity that these youth bring? And if we don't do that, we cannot say that we're doing creative youth development, because we're saying that we're developing this beauty and this creativity in youth. So the very first thing, you know, when I wrote this, I wanted to think about the field and what the field has gone through, and then how now we are tacking on this idea of social justice to a field that has been riddled with ideas of oppression and sexism and racism and all those phobias. And so the work of social justice, I believe, and many scholars believe, and many folks on the ground believe, and many organizations believe, that the work of social justice has to be action. That is actually a verb more than anything. And so when we think about social justice as this this thing that we do, I think we often forget, and I tried to put it in this long-winded, I write long sentences, as you can see. So I tried to put it in this very broad terms, but I write that, to do social justice work in critical youth spaces, before we get to the idea of engaging and fighting and protesting and creating art for justice, we have to go to the idea to have critical self-reflection before we move on to what we think social justice is or how we're going to enact social justice. It has so much to do about who we are as individuals. And we can't do social justice work without ever understanding who we are and to taking that critical reflection on who we are. And so I tried to make sure that was front and center. So before we think about promoting youth or having youth, before we think about having youth challenge racial violence and structure and oppression, we have to be deeply thinking about what we mean when we talk about justice and inclusion and visibility and equity. And those terms get floated around, but I don't think many organizations really deeply think about what they mean when they say those words. And I think organizations that are deeply centered around social justice should take time to really think about, when we say equity, what do we mean by equity? And I'll give you an example of that. Many groups say, oh, we want equity, but I don't see any equity in your staff. I don't see any equity in the people who make positions about youth. I may see equity, I may see Black and brown folks who are on the ground, but the people who make the high level decisions, I don't see anybody Black and brown there. And so you're saying equity, and you're saying you want diversity, but you want that on a very low level. And so I think organizations that say they're about youth and about justice need to really deeply step back and look at their own organizations, look at their own self, and have that critical self-reflection. And so that's what I mean when I talk about this idea that social justice is an action. And it first happens with analytical and understanding your analytical sensibilities and your creativity, your self-reflection, and your critical thinking skills. Then to work for visibility, inclusion, and intersectional justice. And I want to stop there because I make a distinction between social justice and intersectional justice. And I think the work has to be intersectional. And what I mean by the work has to be intersectional is that if we're not thinking about the lives of kids and the complexity of the lives of kids, and they can walk into spaces and not only be Black, but they can be Muslim, and they can be queer, and they can be trans, and they can bring their language and their full selves there. So often hear youth in social justice spaces say, well, yeah, I can be that there, but I can't talk about this. Oh, I can go to that event, but that organization, they're homophobic. So if I can't bring my full self to this creative youth development space, then I don't think it can be about the work of social justice. My next thing that I talk about in the paper is around ideas of censorship. And I think much of the censorship that happens in youth development spaces has to do with whiteness. And so if you could move to the next slide, please. So this is a quote from the one and only Michael Eric Dyson, and it really sums up to me some of the issues that we have within spaces that are for youth, and why the work somehow gets derailed at times, and why it doesn't reach its full potential. And so he says that, to be sure, like the rest of race, whiteness is a fiction, what in the jargon of the academy is termed a social construct, an agreed upon myth that has empirical grit because of its effect, not its essence. But whiteness goes even one better. It is a category of identity that is most useful when its very existence is denied. And that's its twisted genius. And so when I hear that and I read the words of Michael Eric Dyson, and I'm thinking about this within a creative youth development framework, is that we have conversations around Black and brown children all the time, but we never have these deep conversations in these spaces around whiteness and how whiteness happens to censor Blackness. So I'll give you an example. I was at an organization in Boston, and they had this beautiful music studio. Oh, it was top notch. They had everything there. And they had a sign that said no cursing. Now you're in a music studio where kids are supposed to come and be creative and express themselves, but there's no cursing. So you want to do this work, but you want it censored, or you want them to be able to talk about it, but not talk about everything. That's whiteness. And so I think oftentimes we have to understand how whiteness gets in the way, but we never talk about it. And so I challenge groups to not just have conversations about what's the best thing for these Black and brown children, or what do we need to do to serve this community, or what do we need to do for that? But we've never had a conversation about how does whiteness impact our work? And how does whiteness stop us from reaching our full complexity, or how does whiteness stop us from reaching our goals, oftentimes within organizations? And so I think we have to have deeper conversations about something that exists in everything we do, but we never talk about it. And then I love this definition that he gives, because he says that's the genius of whiteness almost. That it's in everything we do and we never talk about it. And then the last point that I want to make is this idea of Afrofuturism. And I talk about this briefly within the text. And the reason why I think Afrofuturism is so important, particularly when we think about youth development spaces and critical youth development spaces and creative youth development spaces, is that Afrofuturism can be whimsical, yes. It can be futuristic, yes. But Afrofuturism does not happen without a serious critique of today. That's the part of Afrofuturism I think most people miss in the hoopla and the excitement around Afrofuturism, is that individuals are studying what has happened today. So when we create new worlds, we don't take the crap with us that we had in the old world. If you're going to create a brand new world and just bring all that with you, you're not really creating a brand new world. And so what Afrofuturism allows us to do is it allows us to dream and to think and to build without whiteness. And I think that's the beauty of Afrofuturism. It's to center Blackness. It's to center being indigenous. It's to center brownness and to say, we're going to start from there. And then we're going to move outward. But the reason why we're starting from there is because we understand how folks have been marginalized. We understand how folks have faced oppression. And so since we know that system so well, we're going to build something more beautiful and more creative that center those folks. And so that means that, we're not going to be including Black people. No, Black people are at the center. They're not being included. They are. And so I think Afrofuturism gives us a space to have conversations with youth that are futuristic. And I also think Afrofuturism is such a tool because it allows them to think of a space that may not be here yet, but it's not inundated with oppression. And I think when we talk about social justice so much, and I'm guilty of this myself. I was doing lessons, working with middle school kids. And one time one of the kids came up to me and she said, well, Dr. Love, what are we doing today? Are we doing oppression? We doing racism today? And I was like, oh, because they were so used to us having those conversations. So, Afrofuturism allows us to do the work of serious critique and to create beautiful images or sounds or movies or whatever our medium is. But it also allows us to have a place that we see the love and the joy and the future of what's possible. And so that's why I wanted to include Afrofuturism in the way in which to think about what a new world could be and how that's important in the work that we're doing in youth development. So it's not always about this present world. It's about, I know this present world so well that I can create something better. So those are the points that I really wanted to hit on before we get into the Q&A. So thank you.
We were having to practice. I said, so y'all just gonna have me go after Dr. Bettina. This how we doing, fam? This how y'all gonna do me like that? All right. Hello, that's me. I want to talk a little bit about preparing ourselves to teach for social justice. You can go to the next slide, please. Bettina's piece, I think, just really hit me in so many ways, and I resonated so much with me. I want to particularly just do a deep dive on the trend number 1, social justice youth development, where she's talking about very specific frameworks around the self-awareness, social awareness, and global awareness that Dr. Sean Jenwright and some of his peers have talked about. Because I think that there's this piece where people are like, okay, well, how do you do it? What are some practical tools? And then talking about the work that I feel like we as educators and teachers need to do to be able to do that self-reflection that Dr. Bettina was talking about earlier. And then I'm gonna wrap it up. So what I want to do is shout out to one of my mentors. So the picture you're seeing up here is Dr. Susan Wilcox. I think it's always important for us to cite Black women when they've done such incredible work. So the framework I'm about to share with you actually comes from the genius mind of this woman here. If you know of a group called Brotherhood Sister Soul in Harlem, Dr. Susan Wilcox created the Sister Soul of Brotherhood Sister Soul. She's a master kind of curriculum developer. And when she was working with us, when I was at Dream Yard several years ago, and we created this framework with teaching artists, she was like, you know, if you really want to be able to look at social justice, you need some type of matrix, she said. You need to look at your core values and put them in a matrix. And I was like, what does that mean? And then I was also inspired by a really big shout out to Kata Swabak and the Boston Youth Evaluation Project. They did some really amazing work back in 2010, and they had this framework that I create, I am, and we connect. And all of us who were working at Dream Yard at the time, we kind of interpret that to be empower, create, and connect, what that meant for us. So could you go to the next slide, please? Again, Dr. Bettina talks about some framing in her piece. And so this framework that I'm sharing with you is a question-based framework. So he talked about problem-posing education and banking system of education, and the importance of really looking at how we're helping young people and helping ourselves pose questions that help us to create a new reality. So what you're about to see is a framework that was created by myself and several teaching artists at Dream Yard several years ago. This framework has changed, it's moved, it's morphed. I think they've added things to it in that time, and that's what frameworks should do. But I really wanted to give a shout out to what we've done. So let's go to the next slide. So the first one is empower. Go to the next slide, please. And these are all the questions that our group of teaching artists and staff one day with Dr. Wilcox created together. And we're looking at this is where the social justice lives. Again, I think this has changed completely so much in the time that we did this back in 2010, but looking at the questions, who am I, where am I, and what can I do? And Dr. Bettina, that really made me think about some of that stuff you were referencing with the self-awareness, social awareness, and global awareness, some of these questions that we came up with. So these framework questions were used to create lesson plans, to have a whole unit plan for young people to ask themselves. You can go to the next one. The next one is create. Go to the next one, please. People were always saying, well, what is social justice? And then what does art look like? How does that live together? So as artists and as teaching artists, what are the questions that we ask ourselves as artists? Who and what inspires me? What do I want to say? How do I effectively express it? So having young people be able to create art, create dialogue around these questions. So go to the final one. Please connect. Go to the next one, please. So this question around community, right? So as we're thinking about who am I with the empower and understanding my environment and being able to change it, how do I make my art to be able to respond to people, and how am I helping to create community, what builds and breaks down community, who and what do I care about? So again, this was a collective, and go to the next slide, please. I want to shout out the people that, again, these are Black, brown folks, these are white folks, these are all my people back in 2010, Evelyn Bajorquez, Alma Kojo, Jason Duchin, Patty Dukes, Odyssey Gourmet, Austin Green, Sydney, Ellen Hagan, Tim Lord, Color Peace, Kimberly Flores, Red Star, Renee Watson, under direction of me and Dr. Susan Wilcox. I know that's a lot to say, but again, I think authorship and collaborative authorship is so important. We don't do any of this work alone. And I want to shout out all the people who are still building on this work, but definitely shout out to my core group. All right, next slide, please. And so I really appreciate it when Dr. Bettina Love was talking about like, who are we? And so there was so much work that we're always saying, who do young people need to be? And how do we need to do the classroom management, all this kind of stuff. And so I wanted to work with teachers around how do we create critical maps about who do we need to teach for social justice. I don't think we realize that sometimes when we're working with young people, that if we haven't worked on the things that we have not healed within ourselves, we can be responding to young people in a way that's but that's the best for them. That we can be triggered, they can remind us of someone, or we can, start to feel, anger in ways that we have not really thought about, like, wait, where is that coming from? What am I feeling right now? And so this is a map that was created by Austin Green around questions of, am I strong enough to be vulnerable? Am I inviting them to lead? So instead of always having answers which are finite, how do we have our work guided by these critical questions? And so you can go to the next slide. These are all just, that's the central questions. You can go to the next slide, please. So these are just teaching artists looking, and teachers who are create their own critical maps around these questions. You can go to the next one. They're in so many different ways. You can go to the next one. And you can go to the next one. So I just wanted to share with you just how teachers were really thinking about, like, how am I asking myself these questions? How can these questions guide my work? So this is critical mapping work. You can go to the next one, and the next one, and the next one. So when I talk, I always end with a picture of my son. His locks are not quite that long anymore. But I end with my son because that's the other piece of this work, is that you need to be able to look in the eyes of a young person and see your own reflection. If you're looking in the eyes of a young person, you're seeing somebody that's not you, or you're not seeing your niece or your nephew or your cousin or someone you love, in my opinion, you can't adequately teach that child. You have to find something in that child that you love and be able to see yourself. And also, they're the best evaluation tool. That's my evaluation tool. My son, Ross. If I look into a classroom, I said, would I put Ross in this class? If I wouldn't put Ross in this class ain't good enough. So if you're looking at your program or your class and you wouldn't put a child that you love in that class, you have some work to do. So if it's not good enough for my child, it's not good enough for your child. And I think that sometimes people are like, well, it's good enough for them. Like, that's all they need. But once you're teaching in this way of just like, nah, it's gotta be the standard, has to be that this is good enough that I would put my child on this class, I think that we would all strive to work differently. So thank you, that's it.
Okay, I am unmuted. Okay, so some of the conversation that we had and some of the paper by Dr. Bettina Love kind of kept bringing me back to this quote by Alicia Garza that I wanted to share first. And this is part of a longer, obviously, something longer that she was saying, but I'm just pulling this one part out. And she says, the task is to try and live our lives in the way that we envision freedom actually looking like and feeling like. Movements are the place that we express the world that we want to see. And so I just, there's a few ways that I feel that will weave its way back through. I'm gonna start with just a little bit about my personal experience growing up at Destiny Arts Center. And I am gonna read a little bit, so pardon me if I'm just kind of, my gaze is shifting. Oh, and I also wanted to say how inspired I am by what both of you shared, and very humbled and honored to follow you on this talk. I kind of can't believe it. So programs like Destiny that center young people of color and folks with identities that continue to be marginalized in our society can be very impactful for young white people who happen to participate, like me. The aim of my Destiny classes and teachers was not specifically to create a beneficial experience for young people like me. And through my participation, I was able to develop a strong sense of who I am and a strong commitment to racial justice, among other values that I continue to this day. And this was one of the places where I began learning how to listen, how to reflect, how to support, and how to hold space. And So kind of Robin was speaking a bit about, you know, teaching artists and those of us who are working with young people doing our own healing work in order to really show up in the best possible way that we can and to do our own reflection work. And so these skills that I started developing as a young person are central to the work that I do today. And then I also just want to say for folks that I believe that as white allies and co-conspirators, it's really important that we follow the lead of our peers of color while at the same time carving out spaces where we can process some of the unlearning and learning that we need to do where it does not burden our colleagues. And so I'm happy to offer myself as a resource, a contact, if anyone is like, how do I start this work or how do I continue this work? I'm happy for you to email me, and I have information and literature and support to offer around this work. So that's all I'm going to say about that. The slide that you see now says Destiny Arts Creative Youth Development Framework. And I completely forgot to start my timer. So okay, I'm just being mindful of time. So as you can see, these are just the headings of the practice that we do at Destiny. This is how we do all of our classes. We teach across many different crafts. But we always start with an opening circle. We always have as a teaching artist, we always share our own artistic experience, whether that means connecting young people to the history of the form that we're teaching or sharing our own personal experience or personal expertise. Then we engage in a creative process. So we find that this is the place where we invite young people to take some skills that they're building in arts and creative youth development classrooms and exercise their own creativity. And then we have a closing circle where we do reflection and you know, whatever is keeping us going through to our next session together. It also has culminating performance on there, which can be something that happens throughout a session or can happen in every session. And I do want to shout out Indy McCasey, who did work with us at Destiny Arts Center to create this framework after all of us kind of observing the kind of work that we were doing with young people. And so kind of what I want to highlight with this is that though we're looking at these artistic practices and we're saying, hey, this is what we do in an arts and creative youth development classroom to cultivate a platform for young people's powerful voices, I think that sometimes when we engage only in reflecting on the artistic practices and we don't overlay some of the more nuanced and important social justice-based questions that my colleagues just pointed to, sometimes when we use this framework, we can even end up becoming agents of the status quo. We can actually be in a classroom, in a school, and we can actually be sort of like reinforcing some of the cultural norms that are actually harmful to our students. And so I'm really inspired to say that we're really working on how are we overlaying other practices and values in order to make sure that we are really using this in a powerful way. And so I just want to highlight a few things that we've been working on. So we in social justice youth development, Dr. Love talks about how Jen Wright and Camarota also reference healing and wellness as a part of this. And something that the Oakland Unified School District has recently been sort of cultivating in some of our sites, and Destiny Arts is kind of partnering around this, is this healing sort of pedagogy or structure or tenets called the 6 R's. And I'm just going to say what those are. They are rhythmic, repetitive, respectful, relevant, relational, and rewarding. And research has found that when these are at play, young people are able to self-regulate and are able to do learning, whether it's in their arts classroom or elsewhere. And we can see that these 6 R's also show up a lot in arts and creative youth development. So I just want to highlight the overlap where healing practices, arts, and creative youth development come together. And there's another 6 things that we've been looking at as well. These are key characteristics of a creative youth development classroom. And I actually would like to cite where this is from, and so I'll follow up with that afterwards. But says that in creative youth development classrooms, we create a safe environment. We are assets-based. That means we're looking at what folks are bringing to the table, like was being talked about in the past 2 talks. We're building strong and powerful relationships. There's rigor and high expectations. We're looking at the whole participant and the whole context that's holistic, and it's youth-driven. So I just kind of wanted to point to where all of these things intersect and how we can continue to build, you know, not just our creative youth development framework, but how can we make sure that that's also healing and that that's also focusing on the kind of, you know, self-awareness, social awareness, and global awareness that we were talking about earlier. And then I think I'm almost out of time, but we can go to the next slide. And I just wanted to highlight that basically, how do we also make sure that we're practicing restorative and reflective and transformative ways inside of our organizations? And I think that something that you all pointed to earlier really reminded me of that. And we're in kind of a deep place of reflection right now where we need to go into our organization and see, like, how have practices in the past caused harm, and what are the values that we're operating from at our center? And then how are we, you know, making sure that then we're continuing those practices into our classrooms and our programs. So the slide that you see is just the Destiny Junior Company, which is one of our youth performing companies at Destiny. And I just wanted to highlight a little bit the work of these young people. We talked about, you know, young people coming up with the content that they feel passionate about and that really affects their lives. And I just wanted to highlight a little bit how intersectional of a movement Black Lives Matter is. It's been a movement that has inspired a lot of our work here at Destiny, particularly with our performance companies. And when we look at an intersectional issue that works to center those most marginalized, then we find that when we do that work and we focus on that, then everybody gets liberated. So I think I've gone maybe like a minute over. So I'm gonna leave it there. Thank you. And I actually, if it's okay, I wanted to ask Robin and Bettina, I was wondering if you might talk a little bit about different age groups with young people. This was a curiosity that came up for me as I was preparing, was like, when are we talking about teens? When are we talking about elementary school young people? Are we talking about, you know, young people at large? And I was just a little bit curious if either of you wanted to speak a little bit to that.
I'll jump in so I can speak before Bettina. For me, social justice for me, it starts as soon as a young person can understand. I think that we forget that young people have a very strong sense of justice. One of the first things you'll hear them say is, "That's not fair," right? The first things they do is call out our hypocrisy. Like, you split that cookie a little bit uneven, they go like, "Wait a minute, this cookie is bigger than the other one," right? So it's, you know, we have, you know, done Black Lives Matter and all those movements and protests with kindergartners, right? So that they're understanding, like, where they are in the world, that they're understanding that there's injustice that need to be undone, but that they're also the ones that can create something new. So, I mean, as soon as, like, you know, they can understand, because they're already so clear about justice and injustice. And that's my take on it.
And I'll just add to that. I'm in 100% agreement. My motto is, when you think you need to lie to a child, that's probably when you should be telling the truth. So that's my motto. So if it starts at an early age and you're saying to a child, ask you a question, I mean, you can take something like Christopher Columbus, right? We lie as a country to children every single year. All right. And so you can talk about these issues with young kids and it can be appropriate for their age group. But the moment you think, I really can't tell the real history, or I really can't, that's the moment you should be telling it. So I always say, when you start to lie to kids, that's probably when you should be doing the social justice work.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Oh, that was really that was real great. that was amazing. Yeah, this conversation around censorship, thank you for bringing that up. Someone in the chat box is also talking about censorship and how that manifests through the adultism, which is the systematic mistreatment of young people. And there's this conversation around age, and I guess I'd love to hear your responses that, you know, when you're at a quote young age, there's a censorship to keep them safe, but when they become into their teens, and all of a sudden we have to keep the teens safe, society away from them, right? So now all of a sudden they're dangerous, and now there's still a safety censorship. But it all still has the same sort of effect that they're not ready, or that we're not ready, and yet they already have no rights, right? They can't have a bank account on their own. They can't move without their own. They're the most controlled group in our society, probably, aside for those who are targeted by the incarceration system. And so I wonder, as you see sort of censorship flowing from those who are 2 and 3 or 10 years old all the way up to 18, like, I think there's some mental health effects that happen to young people who are so controlled and so censored, and then all of a sudden when they're 18, you know, it's sort of this, they're supposed to go out and be this thing, right? And so I wonder sort of what you've seen in young people because of censorship, what that has done to their person and their being and their body.
Yeah, well, I mean, in the summer of 2017, there was a great study that was released, not necessarily around censorship, but it was around the ideas that when youth do not have the ability to deconstruct their world, they will engage in high-risk behavior. So what that means is that I've been told that the world is just, I've been told that the world is right. I really don't have any language to have these conversations because they've been so censored. And when I do try to have the conversation, I am told, just work hard, play nice, be nice. You can be anything you want to be. You just have to work hard. And when I want to have difficult conversations, or I want to ask questions about the world and systematic racism, and I might not have the language, but like you're saying, I know something's wrong. And so what we know now is that, and there's good data that shows that when students engage, or excuse me, when students don't engage in these conversations, when students are not able to have a voice and are censored, and they go out into the real world, and now they're faced with systems of injustice, and they don't know what it is, they start to blame themselves. It's a theory called system justification, which means that I believe the system is right, and I believe the system is just.
Right.
So I have no language to understand what's happening. And now, if I believe the system is just, and I believe the system is right, when something has happened like systematic racism, or when my community is being plagued by gentrification, and I haven't had a conversation about this, but the system is right, the system is just, I begin to blame myself.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of good research that's coming out of, you know, looking at what charter schools have done, looking at what communities have done when they don't have real and authentic conversations with young folk about the world that they're actually living in. And when they just cater and tell them everything's going to be okay, everything's going to be fine, there's nothing wrong, you know, we're doing young folk a disservice, but also now we're starting to see how that impacts their self-esteem, their mental health, and their ideas about what community, what justice, what value system that they have that doesn't align with what they're seeing.
Yeah, it's all internalized. Can we unmute Robin?
That also made me think about like the need to continue to push critical thinking and rigor, because so many of our young people are just taught to bubble in the answer. So when you ask them like, okay, well, what do you think about this thing? Like, what is your thought? What do you think about it? They're not necessarily in their school settings that muscle isn't being worked. So in these out of school places where we're talking about these systems of oppression, we're the ones that are helping them to be able to articulate what they already know in the ways in which they already know it. Because it's not necessarily what's happening in the school setting, because they're not asked to think, they're just asked to bubble in.
Mika, I wonder, oh, go ahead, Bettina.
No, I see a question about hip hop and censorship. I was going to take that question, but
Yeah,
I
go for it.
don't want to move too fast.
I wanted to ask from a youth perspective, Mika, but yeah, I want to also answer that question too, Bettina. Mika, from your time growing up in Destiny and being able to have these critical conversations, did you ever once feel like oftentimes we're speaking for young people, especially when they're younger, like they're not ready, they can't have it, you know, it makes them feel X, Y, and Z. But as a young person who grew up in a space, which I would say, I think all of us would agree has some really critical rigor to it, how was that experience for you?
That is an incredible experience. I actually grew up in a family, but both of my parents are teachers and also were activists. And so, you know, we did a lot of discussing and talking, and I was really encouraged to be critical of sort of like the mainstream ideas that might be passed down to me, and to kind of be in Oakland, which is a very, like Dr. Love refers to the Prop 21 struggle in her paper. And that was something that we were really active around when I was a teen. And so to be growing up and to be, you know, having some kind of information from my family and then be in an activist city, and then be a young person who was engaged in the arts in a place where we could talk about these things. It was like there was a level of alignment around the kind of messaging and exploration that I was able to do, that I think allows me to see my own reality and allows me to question and continue to keep the truth of like kind of the opposite of what we were talking about around like believing that all of this is okay and that it's right and that it's supposed to be this way and that, you know, we're the problem. Like that's life altering for me, because I can't be the person that I am today and be, you know, perhaps hopefully the educator and the, you know, the thinker and just the artist that I am without, you know, being able to like have that exploration and find that alignment. And even because even now I can still feel crazy, but I have some kind of reference point that I do get to go back to. So really powerful.
Thank you, Mika. Thank you. Bettina, you want to answer that question?
Yeah, and thank you, whoever posted the actual article that I'm referencing. The study is Why the Myth of Meritocracy Hurts Kids of Color. And one of the participants put it in the chat box. So thank you, whoever posted that. That was great. But then there's another question about censorship and youth and young kids and how hip hop has inappropriate language and can be seen as sexual. You know, that's a question that I get often because my work is with elementary age students. I work with elementary age students and middle school students using hip hop in the classroom. And the two things that I'll say about that is, first of all, you don't necessarily have to bring the music in. They already know the music, right? I usually bring in instrumentals because they already know the music. So you don't have to, oh, I'm going to bring in this sexually explicit song. No, you can just bring in the instrumental to the song. The kids know the song already. And then second, you know, I don't think the reason I use hip hop in the classroom is not because of rap. It's because of the beauty of hip hop culture. And I think that's what we miss sometimes when we say, well, what about the music? There's more elements to hip hop than the music, right? There is dance, there is graffiti, there is the DJ, there is the fifth element of hip hop, a knowledge of self. There is the language and the way in which language is played with within hip hop. So I think oftentimes rap is the most popular element of hip hop. So we shoot right to that. But that's the last thing I do in the hip hop. That's the last thing I do in my classes with hip hop is rap music, because that's the thing that they know. And our job when using hip hop is to teach them what they don't know about hip hop, the beauty of hip hop, the culture of hip hop. So for me, rap lyrics are last. But even if we're going to use rap lyrics, I think in an elementary age classroom, it is still a time to talk about, hey, do you think when you listen to rap songs, do you think women are treated appropriately in these songs? No, why not? What does it mean to be a feminist? Now, we could have these very elementary age conversations with young people and never bring in any of the inappropriate language. So we can still have those conversations. And then I also think about when we have youth perform. You say youth perform to sexually inappropriate language that has too much cursing. Again, they can perform to the instrumental. They can also perform to the instrumental and have the actual youth rap over that instrumental.
That's right.
So I think I think we give hip hop lyrics sometimes too much power. And what I know about studying hip hop, first and foremost, is the beat.
Mm-hmm.
Kids gravitate, we gravitate to the beat first. And so it's always about the sonic enjoyment, first and foremost, of the music with the beat. So bring the beat in, bring the instrumental in, and have kids flip the song, reimagine the song, say something different about the song. And I think that's our job, not to just give them the song on face value. It's the push. And the last thing I'll say is that, I think our job is to teach youth how to be consumers, but critical consumers, because we're all consumers. But the job is to become a critical consumer. And for me, hip hop gives us space to teach youth how to appreciate something, how to love something, and still how to be critical of something as well.
That's great. Mika or Robin, do you have anything to add? Robin just sitting back like, go ahead. That's great. I love it. I love it. Well, we have a few more minutes. Robin, did you want to add to that?
No, I just wanted to thank Dr. Bettina Love, because that's definitely something that I've in terms of language, if I'm just being 100% real, I mean, I'm hopefully always 100% real, but if I'm 100% real with you right now, in terms of dealing with young people in terms of language and space, I've always been that person that, heavily big believer in Malcolm X and Al-Haj Malik Shabazz talking about you got to challenge yourself to use another word, right? But you're having me to think a little bit differently about how that can be censorship. In my mind, I was thinking about I know you know how to speak, you know how to use that language, and how can I push you to also expand, but not that one is bad or one that's good, but so that you can navigate differently. But listening to you talking, and even when we talked in our last practice session, is actually opening me up to kind of think, to kind of soften that a little bit and try to consider something different. So I appreciate that.
Thank you.
So we have maybe for our final couple of minutes together, a participant, Indy, is saying, if you can speak a little bit more on the themes of trauma-informed / healing practices for practitioners as well, not just for young people. For example, we're working with young immigrant children and talking about detention camps. How can we frame this conversation in a way that doesn't traumatize things? So I think those are two separate questions. Maybe we can look at the trauma-informed healing practices. I know, Robin, you talked a little bit about this in your framework of really having these practices for your practitioners and teaching artists, and really getting them prepared to be our best selves, really, with the young people, right? We have a lot of traumas that we're bringing into a space that if we're not careful on. could be harmful.
Unmute myself. Just this is, I think, a really great place for us to like shout out the work of Dr. Sean Jenwright. I know he does a lot of really great workshops with teaching artists and teachers around the healing practice. But I think there's just in general, we don't really have a lot of time to even reflect on our work. We're especially in doing this work, we're just responding. A lot of the times we're going from, you know, I think when people don't really understand that you do this work, you're kind of on call like all the time, right? It's not like you're just like working with these young people in these spaces. Like you got to go to work with them sometimes. Sometimes you got to figure out like how you're going to make sure that they have the food, the clothes that they need. Like you're providing all of that. So, you know, just the space that we need to be able to reflect, to be able to be kind to ourselves, I think can always be difficult to find. And so I'm always really thankful to be able to read and reflect on the work that Dr. Sean Jenwright has done. A lot of people are doing some really great work in that field, but it's really tough. I don't think all of us have the answers, because whether it's having to deal with funding here and keep this open, we're constantly like going. So, you know, it's very difficult, but you just have to try and make space for it.
Yeah, I think having a self-care practice is really important as a practitioner. I think therapy is beautiful. I think everybody should be in therapy. I think all of us should have a therapist or a practice of therapy, a 12-step program. One of the beautiful apps, and I'm multitasking here, so I didn't put it in the chat box, but my therapist just gave me a beautiful POC app called Liberate. You can get it on iOS or Android. It's called Liberate. It's a red icon with a little person sitting in chakra. Yeah, I think, is that it? Yeah. You're like on it. But it's all people of color, practitioners from around the world who are doing a lot of somatic liberation in the body, lots, and you could do a 5-minute, a 10-minute, but every day as we open at Reframe, when we do circles with the young people or even with our teaching artists, it's a space where we need a self-care practice to start and center ourselves before we enter space sometimes. But I think having a self-care practice is also really important before and after for every practitioner. And then integrate that into your organization, right? How does the organization have a practice? I think I saw Rise in Richmond, California. They sent out a newsletter a couple weeks ago, and they were like, we're healing, we're shutting down for a week to heal and recenter. And that's beautiful, right? They've integrated it into their organizational practice. And so I would encourage everyone to do that. Keep your questions coming. We'll gather those at the Guild and answer those offline. But we have a couple of shout outs and announcements in our last 2 minutes together, because I want to keep us on time as a former stage manager in theater. So I like time management. But let me I want to make sure I get these dates right, because I was just taking notes like everybody else in the wonderful conversation. So this webinar has been recorded and will be sent out to you all along with Dr. Bettina Love's paper again, in case you didn't receive it, and a quick survey to let us know how this webinar, does this platform work for you? What are other webinars that you're wanting to see, people that you want to hear from? We'll take a brief pause on webinars for the month of October, but we encourage you to visit creativeyouthdevelopment.org and sign up for the newsletter, the mailing list, to stay in touch with all the happenings in the CYD field, as well as all the networks that all these people are putting into the chat box. And we'll, again, put all of these things that are in the chat box into that follow-up email from all of you. A couple of announcements. Our partners, Grant Makers in Education, they're having their annual conference on October 22nd. The National Guild for Community Arts Education has a Creative Youth Development track, and their conference is October 30th. And then shout out to our wonderful young people planning the National Young Artists Summit that's taking place in Austin, Texas on November 2nd, which is a completely free summit for youth, by youth, led by youth. All the presenters are young people, everyone's under the age of 20. So it's completely free if you can get to Austin. Lastly, there'll be a follow-up discussion for today's webinar hosted by the Guild's Emerging Leaders Network. And that will take place on Friday, September 27th from 2:30 to 3:30. And the details are available on the Guild website, but we can also put that in the follow-up email as well. Thank you all so much. It's 1 o'clock. We had a beautiful time together. Thanks for sharing space, and we'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Mika. Thanks, Robin. Thanks, Bettina.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.